Okay, I want to speak a little bit about a British fighter by the name of Len Wickwar, British boxer who was mostly active in the pre-war years. Now, this is a guy who I only came across recently, but he stands out for one very significant reason, not just in British boxing, but in world boxing, if this record is accurate. And the record is, this guy apparently had more fights than any other boxer in the history of the ring. 467 fights. 467 fights. Truly phenomenal. Of course we need to take this sort of record with some caution, because with a lot of fighters in the early years, say anything pre-war, and especially before about 1920, records are quite difficult to compile. So it may well be that there are people out there who could also make that claim and who may have had more fights. Presumably this means in licensed professional boxing, so that isn't including street fights and bare knuckle contests and all sorts of other things. Presumably this means in professional licensed boxing. 467 fights is phenomenal. And yet he is hardly a household name. He's not particularly famous. I'm not saying he's completely obscure. There is some information about him online on various websites. He's on BoxRec, he's got a Wikipedia article, but there's only one video of him. And you know, if you say to a British boxing fan, Len Wickwar, a casual British boxing fan, there's a very strong chance they won't have heard of him. So anyway, this is a report from a site called nipperpatdaily.co.uk. Nipperpat Daily was another interesting fighter who is one of the youngest professional boxers ever in a ring, another British fighter. But anyway, this report is by Alex Daly, and it's about Len Wickwar, the busiest boxer in history. So I'm just going to read this directly, it's not very long. Len Wickwar's record of 467 recorded pro fights makes him the most active boxer in history. It is a feat likely never to be bettered. Born Leonard Arthur Wickwar on the 21st of March 1911, the Leicester lad first came to the attention of manager George Biddles when he saw him outbox an experienced pro called Bill Newbold in a sparring session at Leicester's Friar Tuck Gym in 1928. Biddles persuaded the 17-year-old Wickwar to turn pro on the 23rd of October that year, and he stopped stablemate Jimmy Shepherdson inside 4 rounds on his debut. At the time, Wickwar weighed only 7 stone 4 pounds, but eventually he grew to be a lightweight. Biddles handled Wickwar throughout his long career, which he won at least 337 fights with 93 wins inside the distance, and beat such top men as Harry Mason, Arthur Ginger Sad, George Daly, Pat Butler and Kid Farlow. His last bout was on the 6th of February 1947, when he was knocked out by Scotland's Danny Cunningham. By coincidence, a British boxer with the second most recorded fights ever is Wickwar's stablemate George Marsden of Nottingham, who made an amazing 372 contests, was born the same year as Wickwar and died on the exact same day in 1980. There's footage of Wickwar losing to the fearsome Eric Boon on the Pathé News website, but this time, however, the lesser man was a little past his best. He lost that fight, and it's one of his most famous fights. And this gives a little note at the end. BoxRec lists 465 fights for Wickwar, but boxing historian Miles Templeton has 2 more. BoxRec.com is 317 for Marsden, but Miles has chosen 372. So that's why, you know, it's difficult. There might well be further on recorded bouts for both men. Both those guys that's an incredible achievement, whatever way you look at it. And this isn't a case that they had loads of fights and were losing loads of fights. Clearly this guy had a lot of talent. To have had 467 fights and to have won 337 is phenomenal. I mean, that would also presumably rank as some of the most wins in boxing history. Ted Kid Lewis has a claim to that. I know what's his name, very famous fighter, Sandy Sadler's opponent, Wiley Pep, also has a claim to having the most wins. But I think that's a record that will never be surpassed, certainly not nowadays. I mean, a long career by today's standards would be like the Klitschko's having over 60 fights. That's a lot by today's standards. But most fighters sort of retire at between 35 and 50 fights max. Sometimes considerably less than that. So 467 is phenomenal. Although it has to be said, he was fighting at a time when it was common for boxers to be more active, and actually going a bit further back, say to the 20s and the 1910s, it was not uncommon for fighters to have several contests in one day. So when I made the video about greatest British boxers, now there's nothing to suggest that Len Wickwar deserves to be in the great list simply because of the number of fights he had. There's, you know, I know the writer there names a number of big names of the day, but you know, I wouldn't say any of them are absolutely outstanding fighters. The biggest name I guess he faced was Eric Boon, who was a big name in Britain at the time. So maybe that's the reason he's not better known, that whilst he won a lot of fights and he had a hell of a lot of fights, you know, he never fought any really world-class fighters. He didn't have any world title contests or anything like that. Perhaps he'd be a lot better known if he had done. But nevertheless, that's not to take away from that achievement. I mean, the man must have had a head like granite to have taken that amount of punishment in the ring. It's phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. To put that in context, that is 9 times as many as Floyd Mayweather. That's phenomenal. So clearly this guy was very busy, and in his early years he must have had dozens of fights in a single year. These were the days when men would basically have 2 weeks before fights. Now there is a counter argument to that fighters are a lot more conditioned nowadays, and in that sense the sport is tougher. I don't think it's possible to prove or disprove that either way. But anyway, I just thought it was worth making a video about this guy. I'll put a link to his fight footage with Eric Boon. But my goodness, 467 fights. Are you from the Leicester area? Is he well known in Leicester? If you're a boxing fan, have you heard of this guy before? Do you know of any other claims that might surpass that? Remember, 467 fights. Have you heard of any fighter with more fights than that? And I'm talking about regulated fights. I'm not talking about, you know, fairground moves or something. That's phenomenal. It really is. So that's the amazing Len Wickwar of Leicester.